Africa is rising, and the era of timid silence is over. Across the red soils of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré's voice has lit a fire that will not go out. His defiance against the old order, the IMF's chokehold, the shadow of French troops, the endless traps of neocolonialism has inspired millions. And now, in a moment no one saw coming, that same spirit has leapt over borders and found an unlikely ally in East Africa. In Kenya, long celebrated as the West's democratic darling, former Prime Minister Raila Odinga has stepped to the podium with words that shook the continent. Fresh from losing the race for African Union chair to Somalia, he could have walked away quietly. Instead, he dropped a political bombshell calling Western-style democracy a rigged scam designed to keep Africa chained. His voice was not a whisper in some distant hall. It was a roar echoing Traoré's own defiance, and it sent tremors through Nairobi, Ouagadougou, and far beyond. Odinga's message struck deep. How can a continent so rich in gold, oil, and rare earth minerals be so poor in opportunity? How can outsiders meet in London to set the prices of Africa's resources with not a single African in the room? And why should we accept a system that promises democracy but delivers dependency? For those of us watching from afar, this is more than a political quarrel. It's the sound of Africa asking a question it has been denied for decades. Can we shape our own democratic future, one rooted in our heritage, our unity, and our control of our own resources? Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective? Yet, can we continue to trust him, or should Africa prepare for new leadership to carry the torch? Please share if you feel you're among the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. The moment Raila Odinga stepped to the microphone, the room fell into a kind of electric stillness. Cameras were already rolling, not because anyone expected fireworks, but because this was a man who had lived through decades of politics, exile, and national battles, and had nothing left to lose. Fresh from a bitter defeat in the race for African Union chair, Odinga looked less like a man retreating from public life, and more like a soldier returning from the front lines with one last urgent dispatch. He did not ease into his message. Western-style democracy, he declared, is a rigged scam that keeps Africa chained. It was the kind of statement that forces people to sit up, and for a moment, you could almost hear the West's diplomats swallowing hard. Kenya, the country Washington and Brussels so often hold up as the model of African democratic success, was now being painted as a battlefield where truth itself was on trial. Odinga's words were a direct challenge to the very foundation of the post-Cold War African political order. He accused the system of breeding dependency rather than freedom, of creating leaders who serve foreign interests rather than their own people. His voice carried both the weariness of an elder statesman and the urgency of a man who still believed that change was possible, but only if the continent broke away from the illusions it had been sold. He gave examples that were hard to dismiss. Just weeks earlier in London, representatives from the United States and China had met to negotiate the prices of rare minerals, cobalt, lithium, manganese, the lifeblood of the modern technology economy. These minerals are found almost exclusively in African soil. Yet not a single African leader had been invited to the table. How, Odinga asked, can we talk about sovereignty when we are not even consulted on the fate of our own resources? Then came the sharper blow: mineral extraction deals quietly signed by African ministers, trading long-term control of gold, oil, and strategic metals in exchange for short-term security assistance from foreign powers. Human rights groups had already criticized these as mineral first, peace second agreements, and Odinga didn't shy away from naming them for what they were: a new form of economic captivity. For the older generation listening in Africa and abroad, this was a reminder of the 1960s when newly independent African states discovered that political freedom did not automatically mean economic control. The chains had simply changed shape. For the young, who make up nearly 70% of the continent's population, Odinga's speech felt like a rallying cry. It was as if someone had finally said aloud what they had whispered among themselves, that the system had failed them. But Odinga was not just tearing things down, he was building towards something. He painted a picture of a continent that could stand on its own feet, not in isolation but in unity. He called for inter-African trade to rise from its dismal 15% to levels comparable with Europe's 70%. He spoke of open skies and open borders, of high-speed railways linking Cape Town to Cairo, of continental power grids fueled by clean, affordable energy. He described these as low-hanging fruit changes that could be made quickly if there was the political will. As he spoke, there was an unspoken parallel in the minds of many listeners: President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Traoré's young, defiant leadership had already challenged the same Western narratives Odinga was now dismantling. Both men, though from different countries and generations, seemed to be reading from the same unwritten manifesto, one that demanded Africa reclaim both its dignity and its destiny. In a single speech, Odinga transformed his loss in the AU race into something far greater, a catalyst for continental reflection. He wasn't speaking only to Kenya. He wasn't speaking only to politicians. He was speaking to miners in the Congo who watch their land carved up for someone else's profit, to farmers in Mali whose water is diverted for foreign-run plantations, to students in Ghana who dream of work but face a job market strangled by imported goods. This was the event, the moment a veteran politician from one of the West's closest African allies openly joined the chorus of leaders rejecting the imported model of governance. It was a public alignment with a new political wave sweeping the continent, one that values sovereignty over compliance, cooperation over subservience, and unity over fragmentation. For Washington, Paris, and London, the speech was a warning shot. For many Africans, it was confirmation that the tide had indeed turned and that the once isolated defiance of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré was becoming a continental movement. The real turning point came midway through Raila Odinga's speech. His voice, already steady and firm, grew sharper. He began to weave a tapestry of facts and moments that, taken together, exposed a truth many had tried to ignore. He spoke of London's closed-door conference where American and Chinese negotiators calmly discussed the market prices of Africa's rare earth minerals: cobalt for electric cars, lithium for batteries, manganese for steel and electronics. These minerals, Odinga reminded, are not found in the deserts of Nevada or the fields of Beijing. They are here beneath African soil, and yet Africa was not even in the room. There was a pause long enough for the audience to shift uncomfortably, and then he hit harder: mineral for security deals signed quietly by African ministers in dimly lit offices, exchanging decades of control over gold, oil, and critical metals for a few years of foreign military presence. Peace is promised, he said, but only after the mine is opened and the ore is shipped away. The line landed like a hammer blow, drawing murmurs from the crowd. This was the emotional peak. In that moment, Odinga was no longer speaking as a defeated AU candidate. He had become something else entirely: a messenger for a continent tired of being managed, lectured to, and robbed in plain sight. The older listeners remembered the Berlin Conference of 1884, when Africa was carved up by foreign powers without a single African voice in the room. The younger ones thought of the present day, where boardrooms in New York, Paris, and Beijing still decided their economic fate without them. Reactions inside Kenya came swiftly. Some in the political class bristled, warning that his words could strain relations with the West. Business leaders tied to foreign investors called the speech reckless populism. But outside the corridors of power, something else was stirring. University students in Nairobi flooded social media with clips of the speech, adding their own hashtags: "Our minerals," "Our future Africa speaks for itself." Civil society groups issued statements praising Odinga's courage to say what needed to be said. Across Africa, the resonance was unmistakable. In Burkina Faso, where Ibrahim Traoré's administration had already expelled French troops and nationalized key mining assets, the speech was played repeatedly on state television, framed as proof that the movement for sovereignty was no longer isolated. In Mali and Niger, military-led governments saw in Odinga's words a validation of their own defiance against foreign pressure. In Ghana and Nigeria, commentators debated whether their leaders had the will to speak as boldly. Even internationally, the ripple was felt. Western media, while quick to note Odinga's political defeat, could not ignore the substance of his claims. The New York Times ran a headline questioning whether Africa's faith in the Western model is crumbling. French outlets, perhaps more defensive, labeled the speech provocative and warned of anti-Western sentiment gaining legitimacy. In Washington, analysts at think tanks specializing in African affairs held closed briefings, trying to assess whether this was just rhetoric or the early stages of a coordinated political realignment. The U.S. State Department issued a careful statement emphasizing shared democratic values while sidestepping the accusations about economic exploitation. Beijing, meanwhile, stayed largely silent, aware that its own mineral deals were under the same scrutiny. What made this moment so volatile was the undercurrent of unity. For decades, Pan-African rhetoric had been dismissed as utopian or impractical. But here was a respected figure from a pro-Western democracy, echoing the same core ideas as leaders in the ACE alliance. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger countries often portrayed in the West as unstable or authoritarian. The ideological lines were blurring, and the old Cold War-style playbook of dividing African leaders into Democrats and strongmen was becoming harder to enforce. Back in Nairobi, Odinga closed his speech not with anger, but with a call to collective responsibility. He invoked the wisdom of Julius Nyerere, who once said, "Unity will not make us rich, but it will make it harder for Africa to be disregarded and humiliated." He challenged African leaders to move beyond ceremonial summits and take concrete steps, lift visa restrictions between neighboring states, implement the African Continental Free Trade Area in reality, and invest in shared infrastructure before courting outside investment. The crowd rose in applause, not the polite clapping of diplomats, but the raw, sustained applause of people who felt something shift inside them. For some, it was the first time they had heard a leader speak of democracy as more than ballots and campaign slogans, as something rooted in dignity, control over resources, and cultural identity. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, the speech had already begun its second life online. Edited clips with English, French, and Arabic subtitles spread across African social media, carried by diaspora communities into Europe, North America, and the Caribbean. In Burkina Faso, posters appeared showing Odinga and Traoré side by side under the words "different paths, same destination." The West may have dismissed it as another flash of African political theater, but to those listening closely, it felt like the sound of tectonic plates shifting beneath the continent, slow, deep, and unstoppable. In the days following Raila Odinga's speech, the political air in Kenya and across Africa felt different, heavier charged, as if people sensed they were living in the opening chapter of something larger. His words did not just stir emotions, they began to reshape the civic and political conversation in tangible ways. Among ordinary citizens, there was a swell of public engagement. Community radio stations in rural Kenya reported heated debates in market stalls and church courtyards. Taxi drivers, farmers, and small shop owners, many of whom rarely discussed politics beyond election time, began weighing in on questions of sovereignty, resource control, and trade policy. For some, this was the first time they linked the price of fuel, the scarcity of jobs, or the cost of imported goods directly to the way Africa negotiated with the outside world. Student unions at universities in Nairobi, Kisumu, and Mombasa organized resource forums where young people connected Odinga's critiques to local realities: why Kenya imports refined fuel despite having oil deposits, or why farm produce often rots uncollected while supermarkets sell imported goods. These forums grew into petitions demanding that Parliament review all existing mineral and trade agreements for transparency and fairness. Politically, the reaction was more complex. In Kenya's ruling circles, some saw Odinga's speech as a threat to foreign relations, particularly with the United States and European Union, whose development aid and investment projects carry significant political weight. Cabinet ministers issued carefully worded rebuttals, insisting that Kenya's partnerships were balanced and mutually beneficial. Yet, behind closed doors, political strategists worried if Odinga's message gained too much traction, it could embolden opposition leaders and even members of the ruling coalition to challenge long-standing economic arrangements with foreign powers. Across Africa, governments were forced to respond. In Ghana, opposition lawmakers seized on Odinga's remarks to push for renegotiating gold and bauxite contracts. In Senegal, youth-led movements tied his speech to their own demands for limits on foreign fishing fleets depleting coastal waters. In Nigeria, think tanks began exploring legal pathways to reclaim control over lithium deposits from joint ventures dominated by foreign investors. But the most significant political consequence was the way Odinga's intervention blurred ideological lines. Until now, many African leaders who challenged Western influence were quickly labeled as anti-democratic or military strongmen, a classification that often split African public opinion. Odinga, however, came from the heart of a multi-party democracy and had built his career within that system. His criticism could not be dismissed as coming from the fringes. This made it harder for Western governments and media to frame the sovereignty debate as a fight between good Democrats and bad autocrats. Civil society organizations seized the moment. Pan-African advocacy groups, women's cooperatives, and environmental networks began coordinating cross-border campaigns for resource sovereignty. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, activists used Odinga's speech to argue for deeper cooperation between the AES alliance and other African states willing to rethink their economic dependencies. The idea of a continental strategy for resource management, long a dream of the African Union, but rarely acted upon, found new energy. However, the momentum also carried risks. In some countries, ruling parties accused opposition groups of using Odinga's rhetoric to incite unrest or undermine foreign investment. State media in a few pro-Western capitals portrayed the speech as reckless and anti-business. There were whispers of foreign diplomatic pressure to discredit the message before it could influence policy debates. For ordinary Africans, though, the political storm had an unexpected side effect. It encouraged a deeper sense of continental identity. Hashtags like "Our Africa," "Our Rules," and "One Voice" for Africa began trending, linking street protests in Dakar with student forums in Nairobi and public debates in Ouagadougou. The idea that a speech in one capital could inspire activism in another was no longer abstract. It was happening in real time. By the third week after the speech, civic groups in at least 7 African countries had announced plans for a People's Forum on African Sovereignty, a grassroots summit intended to draft citizen-led proposals for trade, resource, and governance reforms. It was a small step, but symbolically powerful, a reminder that the most profound political shifts often begin not in the chambers of power, but in the minds and gatherings of ordinary people. In that sense, Odinga's address had already succeeded. It had breached the walls separating civil discourse from political action. It had reminded millions that the fate of Africa's resources and the fairness of its democracy were not abstract issues to be left to elites. They were the daily bread and dignity of every African citizen. From Washington's vantage point, Raila Odinga's speech was an uncomfortable reminder that the political map of Africa is shifting, and not along the lines American strategists are used to. For decades, the United States has treated Kenya as a reliable anchor in East Africa, a democratic partner, a counter-terrorism ally, and a model for political stability. Hearing one of its most prominent statesmen echo the rhetoric of Ibrahim Traoré, a leader openly challenging Western dominance, raised questions inside the Beltway that officials would rather not answer. Think tanks in D.C. quickly convened closed-door Africa briefings, trying to determine whether this was an isolated moment of political theater or a signal of broader continental realignment. The worry was clear: if a veteran Democrat like Odinga could publicly question the legitimacy of Western-style governance, other leaders, including those still within America's circle of allies, might follow suit. Publicly, the U.S. State Department responded with carefully measured language reaffirming shared democratic values and partnership for prosperity. But the omission was glaring: no direct rebuttal to Odinga's charges of economic exploitation, no defense of the mineral pricing conference in London. Silence in this case spoke volumes. Across the Atlantic, Europe's reaction was more defensive. In Paris, political commentators warned of a dangerous convergence between traditionally pro-Western figures and the so-called sovereigntist leaders of the Sahel. The Financial Times noted that Odinga's criticism made it harder for European governments to maintain the narrative that their influence in Africa was purely benevolent. China, though implicated in the London mineral talks, kept its reaction muted. Beijing's state media barely covered the speech, perhaps wary of drawing attention to its own resource deals that mirrored the very arrangements Odinga condemned. Behind the scenes, Chinese diplomats were likely recalculating their messaging, eager to present themselves as partners in development rather than extractive opportunists. In the Global South, the tone was different. Leaders in Latin America, particularly those in resource-rich nations like Bolivia and Venezuela, openly praised Odinga's stance. Editorials in Brazilian and Indian outlets compared Africa's current crossroads to the moments when their own countries rejected externally dictated economic models. For the African diaspora in North America and Europe, the speech was a rallying point. Community organizations hosted live-streamed discussions framing Odinga's message as part of a larger struggle for dignity and self-determination that transcended continents. Petitions began circulating, urging Western governments to acknowledge Africa's right to set its own democratic and economic course without conditional interference. Yet perhaps the most telling reaction came not from chancelleries or newsrooms, but from the quiet shift in perception among Western publics. For many Americans who have followed Africa only through headlines of aid, conflict, or charity appeals, Odinga's speech amplified online presented a radically different image: African leaders speaking not as petitioners, but as equals demanding a fair seat at the table. This was the subtle but significant danger for the old order. Once ordinary citizens in the West begin to see African demands for sovereignty as reasonable, even overdue, the political space for dismissing them narrows. In that sense, Odinga's words didn't just challenge African politics, they chipped away at the narratives that have long shaped how Africa is understood abroad. Raila Odinga's speech may have lasted less than an hour, but its echo could linger for years. It was not just a critique of governance or a lament for missed opportunities, it was a line drawn in the sand. On one side lies the well-worn path Africa has walked for decades, dependent on external powers, exporting raw wealth while importing instability. On the other side, a road far less certain but undeniably its own, a path toward unity, self-reliance, and a democratic model shaped by African hands. The danger is clear. If Africa hesitates, the vacuum will be filled by the same forces that have for generations extracted its riches while offering little in return. The mineral for security deals Odinga condemned will multiply. The youth who should be building the continent's future will continue to board dangerous boats across the Mediterranean, and the dream of a sovereign united Africa will remain just that, a dream. But there is also opportunity. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and now Kenya, voices, once considered fringe, are moving into the mainstream. Ibrahim Traoré's defiance, once dismissed as the rhetoric of a young revolutionary, now finds resonance in the halls of established democracies. The conversation is shifting, and in politics, shifts in conversation are the first step toward shifts in power. For those of us watching from outside Africa, this is a moment to listen closely. The choices African nations make in the next few years will ripple far beyond their borders, shaping global market security alliances and the moral architecture of the international order. To ignore these voices is to misunderstand the world we are already living in. So the questions remain. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective? Yet, can we continue to trust him to carry this torch, or should Africa prepare for new leadership to take it further? Please share if you feel that you are among the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.